All right, good morning. Thank you so much to Alex and all the organizers for having me. I've been really looking forward to this, and I have to say that when folks originally reached out to me, I was a bit hesitant to take this up for reasons that I'm going to talk to in my presentation, and that's being very mindful of being an American and coming in potentially with another saviorism kind of role in a country that I don't know much about, and I don't understand the geopolitics entirely. But nevertheless, I just wanted to start off by saying I'm very grateful for the chance to share my story. I am Puerto Rican. Puerto Rico is one of the last colonies of the United States. So I'm here to share my story, my perspective on the industry, but most looking forward to learning from you all this week and playing more of an active listening role to see where are there potential synergies going on. So a little bit about who I am and my background. Alex just covered a little bit of it, but I manage one of the 12 data centers at NASA that are responsible for distributing satellite data out to the public. We're a team of about 70 people, half domain scientists, the other half software engineers, working together for collecting over 2,000 data collections of satellite information, putting it out to the public. I'm also co-chairing the OGC GeoZar Standards Working Group, so I was geeking out with a few of you last night on ZAR, and ZAR being the interface of NetCDF and GeoTIFF. Happy to really geek out with any folks this week on all of those topics. That's not what this presentation is going to be about, but just know that that's really my background coming into this. I was brought on to NASA to help their transition to a cloud-native ecosystem. So we are mandated by the federal government to move our data and all of our processes to the cloud. Since then, I've become very involved with things like the Cloud Native Geospatial Foundation. I joined Pangeo as a steering council member, and also still actively involved with a former company that I was associated with called SpaceSense. I do want to give a little bit of context of my background in terms of how I started working with geospatial data. So originally I was studying and using satellites to look at vegetation health from space, specifically transpiration. And I had the very typical introduction to satellites by looking at good old NDVI, good old vegetation indices to try to understand plant health. But we realized about a decade ago that satellites were also measuring a parameter called fluorescence. And it's very interesting. Plants have stomata. They open and close these mouths, their cells. And when they're opening for photosynthesis, they're also emitting a subtle glow of fluorescence. And that glow, we realized we can actually get from satellites. And so a lot of my initial research was just looking at fluorescence as being a better indicator of vegetation health. Instead of it just being an arbitrary index, this is an actual measurement that we can correlate to lab measurements. So pretty interesting results of that. And there's also an ESA mission dedicated now to measuring fluorescence for plant health. Before that, I was also actively working in the water industry, and I had a very interesting opportunity of doing research in high-resolution climate modeling. So originally, I was looking at using Titan, which at that moment was the fastest supercomputer on Earth, to do really ultra-high-resolution hydrological modeling of climate change scenarios, really focused in the western U.S. I was also working at this time at a local water agency, so I had an interesting perspective of doing this research and trying to understand whether water managers were actually using it. The answer to that was no, and so I was constantly trying to figure out why is that? Why did it seem that science was progressing like decades doing ultra-high resolution models, but industry was nowhere near actually using the information? And so I got to talk to water managers, and they were saying, you know, we don't speak with things like 20% more precip in the future. We use things like return intervals. We're engineers. We do plannings for dams based off of return periods. And so we were trying to do work converting these climate metrics to something that was more useful for water managers. But also at this time, I started becoming a little bit apathetic around working in just climate modeling work. I think it was Dr. Elizabeth Ayanna Johnson who wrote a line that said she was tired of writing obituaries to planet Earth. And that's exactly what I felt like I was doing, was just really high resolution models, but just telling everyone this worst case scenario. And I really wanted to do something a bit more tangible, which is when I pivoted to more remote sensing work. and doing things like estimating irrigated area for cities for them to implement budget-based, water-based rate structures, things like this. I went to Europe for my PhD and ended up working for Vito for a project called Internet of Water, where we were putting in microchip sensors, again, trying to couple remote sensing information with a really dense network of in situ measurements, like a 2,500 measurements just in Flanders, which is a very small area in Belgium, which is already a very small country, and trying to understand how we can couple, data-driven modeling approaches. And now more recently, I pivoted more to like software engineering type roles. I've always been a geek about using computers. In every lab I was functioning in, I was curious on how to use things like Google Earth Engine. I ended up working for a startup in France that was called SpaceSense. I'm going to talk a little bit more about what they do, but it was essentially trying to democratize space intelligence. We hear that so often, but we were another company trying to do that, trying to API-ify satellite analytics. And that was my first exposure to working in the cloud and having to deliver data from cloud-based systems. Like I said, about 3 or 4 years ago, NASA had the same mandate from federal government that we had to move all of our data and services to the cloud. So that's my function right now. And if you've ever gotten data from NASA, it's certainly not easy, not an easy thing to do. That's what we're working on to improve. Like I said, I work at one of 12 data centers, and so you would have to arbitrarily know that I work at JESDISC, and you would have to know that what data sets are coming from Goddard, and there's 12 other centers. So it's not an ideal situation. We're trying to address that and trying to converge, and the cloud is really giving us a time to reevaluate how we've been distributing our data and if it's really working for our folks. So that's my scientific technical background, and I'll say that I spent over 12 years in higher education. I'm a professor now tasked to teach things like climate change science to students, geospatial informatics. And I have to say, through all of that education, through working in different countries, no one ever taught me about the root causes of climate change. It wasn't until I was tasked to teach a course on climate resilience that I had to sort of think of this myself and start reading. And what I've come to the conclusion is these root causes are two things, right? Colonialism and capitalism. And I put up two trying to be funny memes that, yeah, I'm kind of that person that feels like, am I about to just ruin all the vibes of a conference by bringing in some really heavy topic? But it's an important conversation we need to have. And then also this side of capitalism. And I will say I'm already impressed by what I've seen, not just in our opening ceremonies here, but walking around campus yesterday at the workshops. I was in a room that had some posters presented around. I have no idea what the topic was, but I saw a little flow chart around all of the island nations of Oceania and this circle pointing to colonization, which I was like, oh wow, that's awesome. They're clearly teaching that in class. And then found this really cool, capitalism ruining your planet, join the resistance at the University of Tasmania. So maybe I'm just preaching to the choir here. I've already been impressed by seeing those words in an academic setting when I have not seen that myself the past 15 years, at least working primarily in the US. So map making historically is very well studied as being a tool of colonialism, right? We have lots of examples. This is one of my favorite ones of the original 13 colonies in the US, and someone just drawing a straight line right across saying we control all of this land. And I am not a cartographer. This is one part of our science. That's not my background though, right? I'm coming from Earth observations, getting data from satellites, drones. So in theory, there should be no error introduced by human interpretation, right? I'm not drawing a map. I'm just representing images of what we should see. But still, I see the influence of this kind of mindset in our industry, which is why for the past year, I've been really reflecting and coming up with strong arguments, trying to understand other perspectives, but ultimately I'm here to pitch that I think Earth observation data should be considered a common good. Okay, a common good, just like how we understand clean water supply, right? Everyone should have a right to clean water. It doesn't mean that it's free, but we can all agree that every human should have clean drinking water. I want us to start thinking about Earth observation data in the same way. But just like all of the other common goods that we have, colonialism and capitalism are encroaching on those and having really negative impacts. And I just want to say I'm not so naive and saying that data should just be free, as in no one pays for it. Of course, there's some interchange of funds going on. Free and accessible doesn't mean that nobody gets paid to do the work, right? I'm actually saying the government should support this just like they do with other common goods. And I'm going to talk about more explicit examples going on and how I see this trend going on in our industry and why I'm here to have an open conversation of how we can do better. So I think historically it's really interesting to see how sciences and the influence of the West has really shaped our understanding of Earth. So across all of the sciences, we've had colonialism and capitalism coming in and really siloing our understanding and our thinking. In other words, we've turned towards more a reductionist style of thinking of, I want to become an expert in just hydrology. And maybe even within hydrology, I only study groundwater, and I'm an expert in groundwater hydrology, yay. Why do we do that, though? From my own background, looking at plant vegetation, for example, from space, it's much easier to study scientifically a single plant in a lab, right? I can perfectly control all of these parameterizations. But once I take that plant and go to an ecosystem scale, all of that physics just fails. And I think the role of capitalism in having us starting to think like that is because it's easier to put a price on a single tree, right? It's much harder to price an entire ecosystem, especially if we don't understand all of the physics going on. But this reductionist style of thinking, I think, is really coming from capitalism because we are constantly trying to think of everything in its most finite state and also in how that serves people, and then we want to put a price on that. And that is our introduction, and that is how we've treated the sciences in recent history. And I laugh and I love to pull examples where I think now we're pivoting and we're kind of rebranding ancient knowledge as innovations. So this is just an example of a paper that came out a few years ago. It's in Nature, The Emergence and Evolution of Earth System Science. Earth system science is a rapidly emergent transdisciplinary endeavor. It emerged in the 1980s following demands for a new science of the Earth, right? Earth has always existed as itself. It was our system of thinking that tried to reduce it into all of these siloed bins: hydrology, atmospheric science, chemical, oceanography. That was a capitalistic influence on how we view science. But now we're realizing, oh wait, everything is interconnected, and we're rebranding that as Earth system science. It's a really, sexy sounding term. I laugh also when I hear like food, energy, water nexus. Our food systems were always connected, right? It was just this style of thinking. And so I like to caution when people throw in phrases like this of questioning whether it's really innovative or are really now just realizing we've kind of messed things up a bit and we're turning back towards ancient knowings and kind of rebranding them. So another example I want to give of how I think our industry, it's a little bit elusive when we talk about trying to scale. It's just from my personal experience working in a startup called SpaceSense. Again, our focus was trying to API-ify satellite data. So we wanted to create a back-end system that would be able to plug into any type of discipline, right? We focused heavily on agritech first, of trying to do really specific analytics for companies and plugging it into existing frameworks, like an irrigation company that was maybe already working with farmers. We would supplement in situ data with satellite data to try to give better information on water quality on the field. But that wasn't working in the sense that we were getting contracts. We were effectively paying ourselves, basically becoming kind of consultants that were specialized in the agritech sector. But we were a startup, right, funded by venture capital. And venture capital isn't out there to just pay your company. The point of them is to make profit. And so in that way, we were not a success because we were not making an excessive amount of profits. We were very successful that we grew from a team of 3 to a team of 15. And I think all of us were geeks at the heart of it and very happy with that. But because we were funded by venture capital, that wasn't enough. And so as a result, we had to try to pivot, we had to try to scale, we had to figure out how to be a unicorn, how to disrupt the industry, and it just didn't work. And I don't think it works that well in our industry. And that's because when we think of metrics that are just based on economics, like trying to understand the ROI on a single satellite image is so abstract, because a satellite image doesn't make you change your practice. We can tell a farmer, hey, we think you could be more efficient in your practices. They still have to do an action. So I can't derive a value from a satellite image. You need really highly custom models, and you need really specific domain knowledge, which is exactly the point, right? You need to have some expertise. We can't scale every single aspect of what we're trying to do in Earth system sciences. And I see vertically integrated companies now largely failing at doing this, right? They end up acquiring a lot of smaller companies that have some domain expertise in hopes that they're gonna scale some solution, and it does not happen. And I think it's us trying to let go of money being the driver here, acknowledging that there is some aspect of scalability that I think we in this room are working on, which is around like compute, right, standards, metadata standards. But this idea that there's gonna be one API to rule them all, and you're gonna become a billionaire off of that, it's not working, and I think it's time for us to revisit that in the industry. A lot of this talk and the abstract, if you read it, is me recently consuming a lot of Vandava Shiva's work, she is an environmental activist based out of India, really focused on seed sovereignty. But she has really great analogies, considering us thinking that data is sort of the new oil. And I started reflecting on this, and it's true, we even use the same kind of terminology, data mining. For example, we use a lot of the same terms when we talk about data. And so just like whoever had oil in the past had the power, whoever has data right now has the power. And I think this is where we are repeating historical mistakes. If we look at where the power is coming in our industry, this is just an example of the venture capital investment in space technology. And most of this money is coming from the Americas and also Europe. And one of my favorite quotes is this: occupation, even in orbit, is colonialism. So we've taken not just, colonizing Earth and the lands here, but now we are colonizing space. And I don't mean colonizing Mars. I'm talking about colonizing the orbital areas around Earth, where most of the satellites are coming from these same countries that have skewed power dynamics. So we are really, unfortunately, I think, replaying out what we've observed here, but now doing it in space. And I like to connect also this overlap with this missionary overtones, right? So previously we used to push colonialistic narratives with religion. And now I feel like as a society we've kind of turned away, and we're replacing that with what I call tech evangelism. And it's these words and phrases that I hear, right? Like, tech's gonna save you and the world, and we know what's best for you. And it's these same expand and conquer strategies that instead of using religion, we're kind of touting it as technology now. And I love this image because if you go to any of these, like AWS reInvent, no offense to AWS, but this looks like church to me, right? You have this figure in the middle of the audience, and I'm like, that feels like church. It's a little too, hits close to home, also like a super raised Catholic person around these comparisons. And I want to give some personal case studies and personal reflections. I think it's really hard for us sometimes to really sit with our duality, right? So I am both part of the colonizer and a person who has been oppressed by colonization by peoples. I sit on both sides of the spectrum. And one of my first projects after my PhD was working for a Horizon 2020 grant called Pavitra Ganga, where we were tasked to go out and study a region in India called Kanpur. So Kanpur is where about 80 to 90% of leather tanning products are tanned in the world. And a byproduct of tanning, you see it in these images here, is this blue sludge that is actually chromium. And chromium is incredibly toxic. And the levels of toxicity were to a point that the villagers could not dump the water back into the river, but they could use it for agriculture, which is crazy, and that's exactly what was going on. So a lot of people were getting sick locally. They had a water treatment facility that was just at capacity and could not extract all the chromium before it was being used again for agriculture. And here I am with some of my European colleagues on a team. And I was brought in to do really high resolution, fancy remote sensing work. I was gonna make a model and plug it into a link node system, and we would be able to warn people when rains came to not drink the water. When I showed up here and saw, one, that there was already a water treatment center that was just honestly not big enough, I look back on this with a little bit of shame, right? Because the issue was not we needed higher resolution satellite data modeling. The issue was globalization and depending on the entire leather industry to be coming out of a small village in India. Right, that was the actual problem. And I left this and I can look back now and say this is such an ironic feeling where it's like you want to do good, right? I'm just a geek at the end of the day. I just want to build cool stuff for useful things. I thought I was being useful, but I look back and it was sort of like, here we are kind of poisoning people and then selling them an antidote while we still poison them is honestly what I look back and feel with something like this, especially when you consider all of the money that it took to bring European and American researchers down there to do this work when the issue was so obvious, right? A small town shouldn't be responsible for the entire global tanning industry. Another example that just hits very close to home for me, like I said, my family is Puerto Rican. Puerto Rico has been really recently devastated by hurricanes, and there's a term called disaster colonialism, and this is just one example of a major satellite company, a private satellite data company, who touted this headline of Hurricane Maria, how one analyst used data and analytics to map a safe path for relief operations in Puerto Rico. So this was someone, probably like you or I, again, trying to do good, building some dashboard, and if you read the fine print, they were selling that dashboard. So it's not like this was made out in the open, like this was a product to be sold because this is a private company. And again, I get it, people need to make money, it's just letting us think of having common sense prevail here, right? Where we know we want satellite data to be used for good. How can we ensure that happens, actually? And we can't always look to private industry to ensure this. This same company that was offering this for, the dashboard that you have to pay for, also has this on their main page, which just trying to hone in on the duality of our industry where, on one hand, they're touting, you see our imagery on the nightly news showing, this is the Black Lives Matter symbology outside of Washington, D.C. during those protests. But at the same time, 90% of their foundational geospatial intelligence is used by the U.S. government for national security, right? So for military operations. That is also, I think, a really uncomfortable part of our industry, that even though I think a lot of us are geeks and we just want to do stuff that's good for climate, a lot of the innovation is actually going for the military complex. And we have to really sit down and acknowledge this and ask really difficult questions. Is the tech we're building being used for the good things that we really want it to be used for? Okay, so that was heavy. I'm gonna take a deep breath because that felt like a lot of negativity, but I do have hope. And I do think there are a bunch of case studies even out here in the audience that I'm really excited to hear from you all. And I want to show some examples that I think are the antithesis of this when we're talking about working in a more collective, collaborative way. So when looking at different roles of different players, I'm coming from government, and I'm just throwing out my suggested sort of hats that these different players typically wear. So I'm working for government. We're a raw Earth observation data provider. We're good at quality control and standards, and we should, in theory, be this trustworthy source of data. We are also incredibly bureaucratic, right? It takes me 4 months to get a GitHub repo approved, okay? So you're not going to get innovation coming from the government, and that's okay because we have private counterparts, right, to be able to innovate. And that's the sector that can really translate this Earth observation info into meaningful metrics. So when I'm talking about Earth observation data being a public good, I'm saying the government should ensure that, and the private sector should be able to go off and, yes, make money trying to make it useful. I'm showing like collaborations that we've had directly between government, like NASA and, for example, Google Earth Engine. I geeked out with a few of you last night around, I'm always thinking of these replica data repositories, right, that the cloud should also help us, I don't know where the slides went, but the cloud should hopefully enable us to be able to have more transparency as far as like where the data is coming from and any sort of manipulations that are done to the data. And so I'm just showing an example that we have with Google Earth Engine folks of trying to enable a more transparent process of them redistributing our data. I'm not sure where the slides went. Okay. Classic. Let's see if that works. There we go. Awesome. Okay. So I talked about government and private, but where I think the meeting ground is and where I'm trying to talk to folks like this in this community at this conference is open source ends up being the meeting ground of these different types of communities. I feel like open source projects tend to be really diverse groups of peoples in many sense in terms of where they're physically located, the companies that they represent. And so as a result, I think open source communities are really good at finding that common ground. So that scalability issue, we're very good at addressing because we're already all coming from different sectors and trying to understand what's this like least common denominator that we can either standardize or work on. And so they end up being highly innovative. And open sourcing a lot of the technology ends up benefiting the community, which I think is a beautiful analogy and anti sort of capitalistic approach of instead of focusing on what is going to make profit, we focus on what do we need to be able to do the useful work that as the geeks in the room we actually want to do. And so I have just examples of where I've seen this coming from things like GeoZar or also working in PangeoForge, where, okay, yeah, we're at a meeting ground of trying to come up with a spec that meets GeoTIFF communities and NetCDF communities. That's what ZAR is sort of becoming. And I get to talk with people from all around the world. I get to meet some collaborators here for the first time that are all joining us from these private and public entities to figure this out. PangeoForge is also like a data translation pipeline. That was maybe my introduction really to working in open source efforts, getting to work with people like UV Panda, who's from 2I2C and Jupyter Hub. And I see this innovation happening organically in our communities. And to me, a successful example is this person who's riding a train on a really, let's say, like weak internet signal, but working on the cloud through the Stack catalog, doing petabyte level analysis in a Jupyter Hub, right? To me, like that's the success story. And I think that is becoming a success because we're all talking from these different hats and coming together. But this innovative work runs on a lot of scattered grants. There's a lot of unpaid labor that can really slow down or deter innovation. And this is where I mostly have been trying to kind of throw a flag in our communities, that a lot of the key folks in open source are now turning to privatization and venture capital as a means to sustain the good ideas that they have because they haven't found an alternative funding mechanism. So a lot of my conversations with you last night, I was like, how are you funded? That's, I feel like, one of the biggest open questions to, again, break this systematic cycle, right, where we don't want brilliant people turning to one style of funding to get the work done. And so what can governments do? What is the role of nonprofits, et cetera? That's stuff I want us to think about. I put an example of the Microsoft Planetary Hub recently shutting down as also a red flag of like, look, we can't bank on the goodwill of some of these huge companies because right now, due to AI, there's a massive compute grab, right? And all the geospatial applications are becoming a lower tier. And so if we're telling researchers, yeah, you can just go on Google Earth Engine, go on Planetary Computer, they can shut that off at any point in time. So there's clearly a need for some federated alternative. I know a lot of folks here are managing their own Jupyter Hub clusters. I can go on, and I think that's the way forward, but all of the sort of overlap and data duplication, like, to me, there needs to be some federated alternative. And the last few things I'm going to end on. So I had given this talk a few months ago at a conference called North 51, which was a conference of mostly executive-level people in the geospatial industry. This is a good example of maybe know your crowd. I thought the crowd was going to be the doers, the engineers. It wasn't. It was the business side of people. And so this presentation was incredibly disruptive. And there was articles written that there was a dramatic tension. And the irony is that maybe 2 hours after I gave this talk, a hedge fund investor tweeted, who was at the conference, "We're going to take the Earth observation industry to the promised land, even if we have to drag them kicking and screaming." And I flagged it as like, that is exactly the rhetoric that I just talked about, that clearly no one paid attention to. And I heard venture capital panelists talk after me and really say the line, "We benefit so much financially from climate change and war." Like, that was just a statement made. And I was in the back like, what? Looking around, not a single reaction in the crowd. I don't think anything I said today is controversial in the slightest bit. And I'm excited to be maybe back home. It's important to do the work. It's important to put ourselves out there with the C-suite people. But I'm excited to talk to the actual doers in the room and hopefully empower us to envision something different. And just last, thinking notes, I want us to move beyond Cartesian ways of thinking. Again, holding space for that duality. It is really uncomfortable to talk about colonizations, but we have to talk about it. And a lot of us are on a spectrum here. It is not good or bad. I'm telling you, I'm from the US. We're terrible at that. But my family is also Puerto Rican. I have to hold space in my brain for being both. We all have to. Fostering diversity in every sense. I mean that in many ways, but if we want to be maybe more practical in open source communities, making sure that everybody has a seat at the table and really evaluating and looking around the room, like what voices are missing or what voices are we not hearing. Being able to have uncomfortable conversations. Again, thank you so much for the organizers for just having space to even talk about these things. I think it's really important, and it's a great shift, not just talking about the technical work that needs to be done, because this is really a people problem, if you ask me. I think climate solutions will always have to address and integrate local voices, and that cannot be scaled. And I'm really looking forward to the next keynote speakers and getting to see some of this real life action of exactly talking to the people who are in the communities that we are trying to build this technology for. Always challenging claims of innovation and progress, right? I am also trying to flex a new part of my brain of when I hear something that's being touted as the next big thing, I question it and I say, is that really innovation, or is that rebranding to try to sell us something? And I think we have a unique opportunity in the next 2 days, just as this group of doers in the industry, to address all of these and more. The last quote that I put up is something that resonates with me. It is coming from a person named Bill Tang, who worked at NASA for 30 years. And I have to say, we have something called the NASA effect, where people assume if you work at NASA, you must be some genius or something like that. That's just not true. There's no ego coming from that. But reflecting on someone who I think you can view NASA as maybe being the pinnacle of their scientific career and working there, his goodbye message read in an email, "I plan to still be actively involved with data, climate, but more with and from within those groups that are on the front lines of the climate and other crises. I hope to be crossing paths with some of you somewhere, if not at the barricades." And this really stuck with me, because you would think working at NASA for all that time, you would feel like you did good, like you peaked in your career. But it's just the beginning, and we're really needing activism being at the forefront of our industry. And we've recently created a Discord channel. I've called it Ethical Orbit, as a play on EO, as a way for us to find each other across companies. And I kind of call this Rogue One. Like, you have to find the other folks who are willing to be a little bit under the table game changers to, I think, shift things in our community. And I really encourage you all to join it if you want to also find out other people who might share the same sentiments as you. And with that, thank you so much. I appreciate the time. Yeah.